request, we will hit the breakpoint in our version 1 endpoint. So now I can press continue and we get back our version 1 response. You can see that the property values are created at UTC, updated at UTC, and last completed at UTC. Also, if we take a look at the response headers, it now contains the supported API versions, which are by default version 1 and version 2 on the Habits controller. Now, if I change this to be a version 2 request and send this request, we will hit the breakpoint in our version 2 endpoint, which is this one here, which returns our version 2 DTO, and now I can press continue and get back a different response where the fields are updated in the representation. So now we are essentially maintaining two different API versions, and this has a major impact on our API surface. First, we have to specify the version numbers in the URIs, which isn't too developer friendly, and also we were forced to version the entire controller in order to support versioning in just one endpoint. Now let me specify our custom media type and send the same request to the version 2 endpoint. You can see I have my hypermedia links present in the response, and the response correctly contains the API version. All of these are now version 2 URIs. But if I update this to version 1 and send the same request, we'll get back the hypermedia links with version 1 inside. And you have to ask yourself, which hypermedia link is now the correct one? Should I use version 1 or should I use version 2? You can see how this introduces a conflict with your hypermedia links, so that's why I want to suggest an alternative approach to API versioning, which achieves similar results, but doesn't force us to change our API surface. Let's go back to our configuration of API versioning, and I want to replace the URL segment API version reader with a different one. I will access the API version reader static class, which exposes a combine method. And this lets me combine multiple API version readers. So I want to specify the media type API version reader, and I want to create a custom media type version reader. So I will access the media type API version reader builder. The default one will use application JSON, and we need our custom one if we want to support our custom media types. For example, I can specify my custom media type with a version wildcard. So I will say application, VND, dev habit, and for example, HateOS, and then version plus JSON. So this is our custom media type API version reader. So let's build it. And now we can do media type versioning inside of our controller endpoints. Now, in order for our custom media type to work as expected, we have to define it with our supported media types in the output formatters. So I'll go to my custom media types, and I'll make a couple of copies here. Let's call this HateOS JSON version 1 and HateOS JSON version 2. And here I can specify the API version as a number right after the HateOS value. But we also have to add the supported media types for our version application JSON media types. So this will be JSON v1 and JSON version 2. And I'm just going to specify here application JSON version 1.0, or even version 1 is simple enough. And here I can specify JSON and then version 2. Let me actually update this to say version 1 and version 2 correctly. And we can leave our default media type, which will use the latest API version if we don't specify one. Now back in dependency injection, I need to add support for these custom media types. So here I'll specify version 1 and version 2, and above I will add JSON v1 and JSON v2 as our custom media types. So now we have the ability to define two API versions inside of our API endpoints. Now let's go back to our Habits controller and see what we have to do to use this. I can get rid of the hard-coded API version in our URI and go back to our default URI. Now let's say I don't want to version all of my endpoints to version 2, so I can omit the API version attribute from the controller itself. But let's say that by default, this controller supports the 1.0 API version. Now in our first endpoint, we want to map to this specific version, and in our second endpoint, I can say that this endpoint uses API version 2.0. So now let's start the application and test out API versioning using media types. I first want to send a request using application JSON as my accept header value. So if I send this request, I will land on the version 2 endpoint because even though version 1 is my default API endpoint, I'm using the current implementation API version selector, which always selects the highest version. So in this case, we're defaulting to version 2. If I want to explicitly target version 1, then I can append version to my media type and send this request, and we will land on the breakpoint in the version 1 endpoint. If I update this to be version 2 and send this request, we will hit our breakpoint targeting version 2. I can press continue, and let's replace this with our custom media type and send this request. We're going to land on the version 2 endpoint, which is the default one. If I want to specify the API version here, I append 1 after HateOS, and if I send this request, we will land in the version 1 endpoint as expected. And if I update this to explicitly target version 2 and send this request, we will land in our version 2 endpoint. Now, this current implementation is a bit restrictive when it comes to my other API endpoints. For example, if I send a request to fetch the habits, I will get back a 400 bad request because I didn't explicitly define the API version here, and the default one always uses the highest version, which is version 2.0 defined on my single endpoint. So if you want to avoid this behavior and always use the default API version, you can specify the default API version selector, and then that's always going to use the default API version when you don't specify one. So now if I resend this request, I will get back a response because it's properly going to map my request to the only endpoint that I have. And this approach allows me to only do API versioning on the endpoints where I need it, and I can also avoid changing the API contract and use custom media types to communicate which API version I want to be using. And this versioning approach is the most aligned with RESTful APIs. So I think we can wrap up our implementation of API versioning inside of our RESTful API, and we can move on to our next lesson, which is a very important topic, and here I want to discuss API change management. So far we were discussing versioning, but what if we don't have to do versioning at all?